A young woman would go missing in the swamps of Louisiana, and all that was left behind was some bare footprints and the belongings of her purse. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you know what to do. Let's get started. Audrey Alta Moate was last seen on Frenier Beach near Laplace, Louisiana on November 24th, 1956. That morning, a hunter and his son saw a blue four-door 1953 Nash Rambler parked about 5 yards from the shore of the lake. Inside that car was a man and woman, and they were in the back seat. Later, the hunter was able to identify the people in that car, and one of them happened to be Audrey. The other was a 46-year-old man named Thomas Adolph Hoddard Sr. The hunters would come back the same way that afternoon, and they did see the Nash Rambler again, and it was parked in the same location. But this time, the front passenger side door was open. He returned the next day at 10:30 a.m., and when he saw the car still parked where it had been the day before, him and his son went to investigate. In the car, there was a basket of food, which was packed probably for a picnic, and the keys were still in the ignition. The front seat of the car had been folded backwards so that it was level with the rear seating, which formed somewhat of a bed, and there was a pillow and sleeping bag spread across the bed. On top of that pillow and sleeping bag, 46-year-old Thomas was laying there. It appears that he had been shot in the back and that someone had pressed a 16-gauge shotgun against the rear window glass and then fired. He had been dead between 7 and 30 hours by the time his body was discovered, and it didn't look like a robbery. He still had his wallet, his identification, a credit card, and a small amount of cash on him. But on the ground nearby, there were partial contents of a woman's purse. Women's clothing, shoes, eyeglasses were all found on the floor of the car. Even more eerie, small footprints as if it was a woman's bare feet led from the car into the woods nearby, and the prints were spaced pretty far apart, indicating that the woman had probably been running away. Along with the bare footprints were the tracks of a man's boot. 5 feet away from the car, it appeared that a struggle had taken place, and a set of keys, not from the Nash Rambler, were found on the ground. The footprints ended at a road leading to the main highway, and a single tire track, possibly from a motorcycle, was located. But Audrey was nowhere to be found, and she has never been seen or heard from again. Her purse had also been missing and never found. At the time of her disappearance, Audrey was a divorced and single parent of 3 children. Audrey had moved in with her mother so that she could help raise her 3 children. It turns out that Audrey's family believed that Thomas and Audrey had been good friends, but it seems that the two had been having an affair for the last 2 years, and Thomas was married and had 2 children. It appears that the two met for kind of these Saturday trysts when Thomas's wife thought he was working. After her disappearance, her 1949 Oldsmobile was found at the cafe where Thomas had picked her up, and the keys that were found at the scene belonged to that car, Audrey's 1949 Oldsmobile. But it turns out her relationship with Thomas wasn't the only secret in her life. She had told her family that following a nervous breakdown while undergoing treatment at a mental health facility, she had adopted a baby girl. That child was named Jacqueline and was a year old at the time of her disappearance. But when she disappeared, police learned that Audrey had been living in a rented apartment in Baton Rouge, just 1 mile from her mother's home, during the time she was supposed to be in that mental health facility. And Jacqueline was in fact her biological daughter. She was born in a local hospital where Audrey had checked herself in under the name Audrey A. Hoddard, which was Thomas Hoddard's last name. And when police were able to look at the contents of Audrey's bank safety deposit box 7 years after her disappearance, it contained one thing. And that one thing was Jacqueline's birth certificate, and it listed Thomas as the father. And this case gets even more sinister. Audrey's 2 children went to stay with their paternal grandmother, Norma, in New Orleans, Louisiana, after Audrey went missing. On December 6, 2 weeks after Audrey disappeared, Norma received a call from someone identifying herself as Audrey. The caller would say, "Mom, this is Audrey. I'm in very bad trouble and I need help." Norma would say, "Where are you, Audrey?" And then the line cut off. Of course, it wasn't confirmed that this caller was Audrey, although Norma firmly believed that it was. She said that she recognized Audrey's accent and that Audrey always called her mom. So the police were able to trace this call to a neighborhood near the French Quarter of New Orleans, and when they canvassed the area with photos of Audrey asking if anyone had seen her, 2 servers at the Café du Monde described seeing a customer matching Audrey's description in the cafe the night before Norma got the call. They said the woman, who looked haggard and disheveled, ordered donuts with coffee but left shortly afterwards without finishing her food. A housewife in New Orleans would also identify Audrey from a photo. She would state that Audrey had come to her home on December 6th, the day of the phone call to Norma, and asked about a room to rent and to use her phone. The woman, who stayed for dinner with the housewife and her husband, gave a name that sounded like Miss Moate or Miss Moore and said her mother lived in Baton Rouge. Police didn't believe that Audrey was involved in killing Thomas, and they stated that she had no real motive to kill him. She left behind money in her savings account, and although her last paycheck disappeared with her, it was never found. Audrey's ex-husband, George Moate Sr., was interviewed by police and said that their parting had been amicable and he hadn't seen her since their divorce. Apparently, he was ruled out as a suspect after providing an alibi. Authorities would also question the hunters and trappers who lived by and frequented the area where Thomas had been killed, but none of them were ever deemed suspects. In March of 1959, 2.5 years after Thomas had been murdered and Audrey's disappearance, there was another violent crime near that very same area, and it was quite similar. Frank Martinez was fishing at the beach, and his wife Leonie was sitting in the parked car nearby. A man would fire a .38 caliber revolver through the glass window and wounded her in the shoulder before she tried to open the locked car and run. So her only option at that point was to lean on the car horn until her husband Frank came running to her. The man with the gun would run off to his own car and drive away. She did survive her injuries, and the couple was able to get the car's license plate number, and within hours, police arrested a man named Edmund Joseph Dew. He had been one of the people who volunteered to help search for Audrey in the aftermath of her disappearance. Investigators would find a large collection of pornographic photos in his house, as well as 50 lipstick applicators, 5 women's purses, and over a dozen sex magazines. In the trunk of his car, they found more purses, including a plain black cloth one that matched the description of Audrey's missing purse. Edmund Joseph would admit to shooting Leonie Martinez, and he led police to the spot where he dumped the gun he had used, but said he didn't kill Thomas and didn't know where Audrey's whereabouts were. He did say that he had owned a 16-gauge shotgun in 1956, but had lost it in 1958. He would take 2 polygraph tests, and he failed both. He would eventually plead guilty to attempted murder, and he served 10 years in prison. He would eventually die in 2003, and he was never charged in Audrey's disappearance and Thomas's murder, but it's not really clear if he was still a suspect. In 1989, a person named Marvel Carona claimed her father, Ernest Acosta, had had information about the case. Apparently, he had lived within a mile of the murder scene. Before he died in 1980, Ernest told relatives that his late wife, Carolina, killed both Audrey and Thomas outside their home in 1956, and he helped cover it up. Ernest said that he put Thomas's body in the car and drove it back to the beach, and he and Carolina hid Audrey's body in a metal fish trap in their yard until the search for her stopped. He said the next day they stuffed Audrey's body into a 9-foot Civil War cannon and sunk it in the swamp. An identical cannon had been discovered in 1977 and stood on display at the parish courthouse until 2019, but it would have been too heavy for 2 people to move it without using heavy machinery. And of course, the father's account about the murder didn't match the evidence, as Thomas had been shot inside the car. But a retired detective thinks that Ernest was involved. He believes Ernest killed Thomas and then raped and murdered Audrey at his home before hiding the body. After Audrey's disappearance, her mother moved to Oregon. She would ask the newspapers to, quote, report her new address for when Audrey came back looking for her. She took Jacqueline with her, and the girl was eventually adopted by relatives. Audrey's mother died in the 1980s, and Jacqueline is still alive. Unfortunately, Audrey was never located, and Thomas's killer was never identified, but foul play is strongly suspected in her case. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you next week.